Okay, so we are here with Mike Miller, continuing our conversation. And like I said just before, I think we ended around 1963. You were starting to talk about Bob Moses and sent me the amazing birthday tribute that Bob gave to you. And can you just tell us a little bit about your relationship with him?
Well, I met him the first time, I think, when he came out here on a speaking tour. And then when I was in Greenwood, Mississippi, the summer of 63, that was where his office, I mean, he was based there. So I got to spend a lot of time around him. And the more I saw and listened, the more I came to admire and respect him. And we became friends just in the course of our time working together. And then we kind of resumed many years later with the algebra project. So he's a person I deeply admired and had a great deal of warmth for. Very, very special. And no one I know remotely is like him. I mean, I know people who are, great people in the world and great people personally, but this combination of low-key, understated modesty with doing great things is quite striking.
Do you have any sense of what motivated him at a personal level?
Well, he has some history of in his family of involvement, and I think his father raised him to be kind of on the side of the little guy. So he came by this pretty straightforwardly. There's a funny story. When he first showed up in Atlanta, he was viewed kind of suspiciously by the other SNCC people who were almost all Southern. I think maybe all Southern. And so he's a little older. He's a Harvard graduate. So they at first thought he was a communist infiltrator. And then they watched, he did what he was supposed to do. He never tried to impose himself on anybody. So they finally decided this hunt for communists was counterproductive. And they just said, this guy's good. Let's welcome him.
And so in 1963, obviously a lot is going on within the movement. And what exactly was your role in SNCC at that time?
Well, I had been the field secretary for the Bay Area, Northern California Bay Area. And when Sam Block and Willie Peacock were out here in December, I said to them, I can't keep doing this work out here being part of what you're doing in the South. So they invited me to come to Greenwood in the summer of 63, which I did. But they hadn't talked to Bob about it, who was the state director. And Bob initially thought it was a bad idea because their experience when who's the couple who headed SCEF? Bradens. When the Bradens had come on a visit to the Delta, Ann and Carl, it had increased the violence against local Black people. So Bob was concerned that having a white guy down there was going to increase violence against Black people. So they huddled, Jim Foreman, Bob Moses, Sam Block, and they agreed that, all right, well, we'll let this guy, Mike Miller and Dick Fry, who was another white guy, we'll let them stay, but they got to stay close to the office. That's what happened. And we weren't there for a week. I think I told you this story about being picked up by the cops, didn't I?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got that one on the first.
Yeah. So we weren't there for a week when Dick and I were walking from the office, literally just one block to the corner store, and we got picked up. So, but I don't think our presence had the effect that Bob worried about.
And then it was that same year that you got in the car accident, correct?
Yes, I later I returned home, and then Bob called and asked if I could come down to work on the Aaron Henry campaign. Aaron Henry was running a parallel. No, maybe he was running in the regular Democratic primary. I can't remember. Anyway, so I said sure, and turned around, went back, and got in this accident that I think the first or second day I was there.
It was
So that,
interesting talking to Mike Sayer. He actually feels, I think he's expressed this to you before, but he still feels so guilty that I think he's the one that sent you out, or he thinks he's the one that sent you guys out to run that errand, and feels so badly that you were in that car accident.
well, I don't feel badly about Mike sending us out. So I have to get in touch with him and tell him I'll have to give him a guilt relief pill.
Yeah, I think he needs it. But you didn't feel any other threats or any other times where you felt your safety was in jeopardy while you were in Mississippi.
Not really. I mean, when I was in Greenwood, I didn't know any local. I met no local white people, so I was deep within the Black community. And I just didn't have occasion be around white people who might frighten me, except this incident with the cops, and that was enough fright for a summer.
Was your mother or your family and friends, outside of the South, were they worried for your safety?
Oh yeah. Yeah, they thought, I mean, some of them thought I shouldn't go and others okay to go, but were fearful. So, and then when I got in the accident, they did a big blood drive here. So I have the blood of some, I don't know, 80 or 100 Bay Area, either directly or indirectly flowing in my veins.
And so remind us how, after that accident, how did you end up coming back and getting back into SNCC?
Well, I was in the University of Mississippi Hospital in Jackson for about 3 weeks, and then I came back, and my arm was still in a cast, and I just resumed my role here. When I left, I left. I mean, I did a good organizing job here, so when I left, I wasn't really missed in terms of the ongoing fundraising, education, political support work that this office did. I learned recently, I don't know if I told you this, but there's some Black guy, I think at the University of Indiana, who's doing research on that period and who's spoken with me. And he told me last month that he'd seen a document in which Jim Foreman referred to me as our man on the West Coast. So that was kind of nice to hear.
Oh yeah, no, you didn't tell me that. That's really cool. You'll have to hook me up with him, because I probably know who he is. Out of the historians in the world, all kind of know each other.
Yeah, well, if you say his name, I'll remember it.
It's not William Sturkey, is it? Bill Sturkey?
No.
No, okay. No. Because it's like he's not at Indiana, but I know he does work on like Freedom Summer and everything. So all right. So are you going literally door to door now campaigning for
in Mississippi?
MFDP? Yeah. Or
I did very little canvassing. That was one of the things that they were a little nervous about. I did some, but not a whole lot. I more when the buses went to the March on Washington, Greenwood was the coordination point, and because I had more administrative experience than other people, I kind of coordinated the filling and dispatching of the buses, and I wrote news releases. I remember thinking one time, what the heck, I'm gonna send a news release to the Ghana Times, and about 2 weeks later, we get a phone call from the State Department.
oh wow.
Please, we don't want you releasing stories like this in Africa. So I thought, well, that's a good tactic.
So do you think it went through to Ghana and then they turned it into the State Department, or do you think the State Department was going through your mail?
No, they printed it. The Ghana Times printed it. It was front page news story in Ghana, which the State Department was embarrassed by.
That's amazing that they ran the piece. I didn't realize. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And did you? Sorry, go ahead.
When the buses, then there was a huge van, moving van, came down with food for people in the Delta. And it was pretty chaotic when it first arrived. And people in the office were taking stuff home and stuff like that. And I got really upset about it. Probably wasn't very appropriate in how I acted, but I did. And I said, look, hey guys, we gotta we got to impose some order on this. And so we had a staff meeting and decided that the first priority would be people who tried to register. And we were going to put the food on shelves. So I kind of organized that, but it was more an internal office.
And so did you ever feel like, or did people in the movement feel like you were being watched by the FBI or anybody at the federal level, the State Department level, outside of, local Mississippi people?
No, I don't think so.
Because it's amazing to go back through the FBI files now and see how much surveillance they really were doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, your name's probably in a few files, even redacted somewhere.
Not an FBI file this thick.
Do you really? How do you know about it?
I wrote away. There was a time when the Justice Department was liberal. I can't remember who the president at the time was, but I just wrote away for it. And
So you have it. Wow.
But there's so much redacted. I mean, there are whole pages sometimes, almost the whole pages is every line is blackened out. So I don't know what all they had. And there are funny things in there because they mix me up with other Mike Millers. They have me at places where I couldn't possibly have been, and I know I wasn't. So it's a kind of an amusing document.
How long were they watching you? What were the span of the years?
Well, it's I think it's probably the late 50s for about 10 years.
And mainly centered on the anti-racist stuff
Yeah.
that you were doing. They didn't care so much about organizing in other ways, or?
No, well, I was involved. We had a committee at Berkeley against intervention in Cuba. So they watched that. And there were probably a couple other things, but most of what I was doing was domestic, farm worker support, local anti-urban renewal, community organizing, SNCC support.
And so when you're getting ready to send these buses of people up to DC, are you guys giving them any real direction about how to handle things, and how, if so, how is that done? Is that through written communication? Are you holding big meetings with people?
I think there were briefings on the buses. There were people designated to do briefings on the buses, but there wasn't a whole lot. Dick and I went. We were the only whites on our bus. It was quite an experience, as you can imagine. Just being among that many people gathered for this purpose.
And how did you feel after that was over? What were your spirits like?
We SNCC people were kind of ambivalent about it. In a sense, we thought, well, this is just another one of these big mobilizations that don't leave anything behind. On the other hand, you had to be impressed with how many people were willing to come to Washington on behalf of the civil rights movement in the South. So, but generally, a lot of SNCC people were, and me among them, were critical of this King's general use of these big mobilizations that didn't leave a lot behind, and often or sometimes left local people vulnerable to white retaliation.
And then coming back to Mississippi after that, just give me an idea of what's happening on the ground there at this point in late 63, early 64.
Well, until the Aaron Henry campaign, mostly people are just going door to door trying to convince people to go down to the county courthouse to try to register to vote. And they aren't convincing very many people. I mean, it was, patient, dull, boring work in some ways. And then the Aaron Henry campaign stirred excitement. So people were participated in that mock election. That's what it was called. It was called a mock election. And that was after I'd gotten back. So I didn't experience that directly, but I knew I'd hear about it, and and I think people were quite pleased when they thought about it that 80,000 people, I think, participated. And we had a great group of lawyers. We sent about 50 lawyers from the Bay Area. I think it was the biggest delegation of lawyers in the country, partly because of my political orientation toward how you did these things. I knew that we could get the National Lawyers Guild lawyers. That was not a problem. But I wanted to see if we could get more mainstream lawyers. And so the chair of Friends of SNCC, Naomi Lauder, was a key liberal activist here in the Bay Area. and had incredible relationships with the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So we had lunch one day and kind of plotted. And she said, I know exactly who we need. So we had lunch with this guy, Ed Stern, and he agreed to do it. And sure enough, he was the perfect guy. He later became a judge, but he had respect in the guild, but he also could reach more mainstream lawyers. And he said, I'm going to get some corporate lawyers to go. And he said, they're never going to be the same when they get back. And so he did. He recruited some mainstream big downtown law firms. He got some people from there. That was a good effort. And then by the end of 63 or late 63, they're already talking about the big summer project, which is very heatedly debated in SNCC. And it's an interesting division because local Black people were for it. Local activist Black people, by and large, were for it. SNCC people were ambivalent about it. Many of them feared that the developing leadership of local Black young people as field secretaries would be undermined by these Northern students who had more education, who would benefit from patterns of deference that SNCC was trying to undo, and so on. And there was truth. There were some places where that happened for the most part. In our recruitment out here, we screened a couple of people or a few people out because they just were too savior complex in their understandings of why they were going to Mississippi. So it was a touchy thing. And then Louis Allen, Herbert Lee had been murdered by his state assemblyman in southeast Mississippi, either in Amite or Pike County, I think. And Louis Allen had been a witness, but he lied in his initial testimony and said the killing was in self-defense. And then he went to Bob, I think he went to Bob Moses and said, I can't. He had a wonderful phrase, if I can find it, I'll send it to you. He said, you get in trouble with God if you lie about a dead man. So I got to tell the truth. I think called the FBI, or he called the Justice Department, and the Justice Department somehow got the FBI involved. And then obviously there was a leak from the FBI to Southern white racists, and Louis Allen was killed by them, father of 10. So that tipped Bob. Bob up to that point had been kind of standoffish, as he usually was in heated internal debates. But the murder of Louis Allen convinced him, if we don't get the national political structure involved in Mississippi, we're just going to be. And so he became a supporter of the summer project. And I think at a Hattiesburg, Mississippi staff meeting in either late 63 or early 64, he lent his weight to the pro summer project side, and that swung the thing. And so the next big thing we were involved in, apart from fundraising, was recruiting people to go south. And we had a good number from the Bay Area.
And so were you traveling back and forth now, or were you still?
I'm now based back in San Francisco, and I'm only going south for staff meetings. SNCC had these marathon staff meetings that ran, God, the way I remember it is 4 or 5 nonstop days and nights. Often intense internal debate, would sometimes get angry, and then people would get up and start singing, and we'd all get around and cross our arms and do this rocking thing that accompanied singing "We Shall Overcome," and that calmed the troubled waters. So the whole SNCC experience was there's nothing like it in my life. So peace would be restored internally, and we'd move forward. So I went to staff meetings at Highlander. There's a conference center down in Waveland on the coast. Gammon Seminary in Atlanta. Let's see, where else? There might have been a couple at Gammon. There might have been Tougaloo. Maybe, I'm not sure about Tougaloo. Anyway, so I didn't go to all of them, but I went to staff meetings.
Were those monthly, or did it just depend?
Oh, they probably happen around 4 times a year.
Okay.
Maybe three times, 4 times. I wrote a paper for one staff meeting that led SNCC to adopt the relationship with the Farm Workers Union out here. So that happened. some of the key people. Stokely, he was still Stokely, maybe Bob Moses, maybe Ivanhoe Donaldson. I can't remember. And Terry Cannon, who by then was editor of our newspaper, The Movement, and no, there weren't 5 of us. I've got one too many Black people in this group. But anyway, we went down to Delano, which was headquarters for the farm workers, and had a meeting with Dolores Huerta, who was kind of number 2 with Chavez.
Mm-hmm.
And they liked the idea, so we had an exchange. They were supposed to send 2 people to Mississippi, which they never did, but we sent and supported 2 people who went to them, one of whom was Marshall Gans, who became a strong organizer in Mississippi, and then a very important organizer in the farm workers when he went to the farm workers. Now, he'd already heard about the farm workers, a priest by the name of Father Leroy, who later laicized Leroy Chatfield. But Marshall was on SNCC payroll while he was working, doing the farm workers' work. So that was a nice exchange that I kind of was responsible for arranging. And because we were doing well on the fundraising, it was okay with SNCC that I was involved in local stuff. And then I think in 65, so the local stuff got me into anti-urban renewal. Anti-urban renewal got me in touch with inner city Protestant ministers, and particularly the Department of Urban Work or the Presbyterian Church. And our SNCC office moved into the same church building where the Department of Urban Work was. So I got to know the 2 key ministers there, Bill Grace and Dave Knotts, very, very well. And Dave Knotts was what was called a detached minister. He didn't have a congregation. And so he was working in the Mission District, just meeting local leaders and making himself useful and so on and so on. So he was a key person in putting together the anti-urban renewal effort in the mission. And I already had Western Addition, which was the Black community, anti-urban renewal experience, and South of Market, which was an elderly, mostly white retiree and Filipino neighborhood. So I had experienced anti-urban renewal there, all this on SNCC. And so when urban renewal threatened the Mission District, which was largely Latino, people there wanted me to become involved in that. So I did. And through these inner city ministers, I got connected with their effort to bring Saul Alinsky to the Bay Area. So I was doing that. So I was as a SNCC field secretary, I was doing a lot of stuff.
So just on a practical day-to-day, your day-to-day obviously changed every single day, but how much of it was, you sitting at home and making phone calls and sending letters, and how much of it was you out, in the field doing that kind of work?
By then, we had a staff. So I was supervising a staff. Gail Brown was a really top flight administrator, and she organized all our direct mail parties. We raised a lot of money through direct mail. And the Movement newspaper, which has started out as a little Bay Area Friends of SNCC newsletter and expanded. Have you seen the Movement?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so it became a very lively movement newspaper with national circulation. I'd go into the office, and some days I'd be in the Mission District, some days I'd be in South of Market. Earlier, the Western Addition. The Western Addition thing was a project of the Housing Committee, NAACP, the Longshoremen's Union, Warehouse Local, and SNCC. So I was running that. I mean, we had that summer of 65, we had 60, 80 doing, putting in substantial hours of volunteer time. So I was supervising that. I had a lot to do.
And so did you ever end up moving back to Mississippi, or this was still, you were going back and forth the whole time?
Only for staff. The only time I went south was staff meetings.
Okay.
Until October 66. These 3 of these inner city ministers and I were meeting with Alinsky at the San Francisco airport. Did I tell you some of this?
I don't think of this story. I mean, I know the earlier how you met Alinsky, but not anything later.
So by this time, Alinsky had said to people here in the religious world, you raise $250,000 and I'll come and we'll start a training institute for organizers in the Bay Area. And we'll do an organizing project in one of Oakland's black neighborhoods, either East or West Oakland, and we'll do an organizing project in the largely Latino Mission District in San Francisco. He had two 10-day workshops, I think one in 65 and one in early 66. And each of them drew about, I don't know, 25, 30, maybe even a few more Bay Area clergy, Catholic, Protestant. I don't think we had any rabbis yet. And they were well received. So there was this growing base clergy support for bringing Alinsky to the Bay Area. And these workshops, I mean, 10 days with him, you got a really deep exposure to his thinking and practice. So I went to both of those. By this time, I was convinced that Alinsky had answers to most of the problems SNCC was facing. And so I was interested in connecting the two of them. And that happened. That happened in part because of what I was doing, but also independent of me. Stokely and Alinsky ended up on a panel together at what had been Central United Methodist Church in Detroit. And I can't remember the pastor's name, but he moved from being a mainline Protestant to a nationalist. I think he made his church independent. So I don't think it was Methodist later on. There was a panel there that was sponsored by church people, and it was billed as a debate between Alinsky and Stokely Carmichael. And so a woman I know or knew at the time, who was a reporter for the newspaper in Detroit, covered that debate. And so she told me two kind of funny stories. She said, when Alinsky opened his remarks, he said, if you came here expecting a debate, you're going to be disappointed. We don't go into Black communities and end up with pastel power.
That's good.
So that was one line. And then one of the people in the audience characterized Stokely as a man of hate. And Stokely was about to respond. Alinsky inserted himself into the situation and said, the man you see with me on this panel is not a man of hate. He is a man of love. Carol, that's this woman I knew, tears started welling up in Stokely's eyes. So then Alinsky said, that's not a man of hate. Or something like that. So then Stokely went to Rochester, which is where probably the most effective of the Black community organizing projects done by Alinsky was. It was called FIGHT. And the head of FIGHT was a guy named Minister Franklin Florence. His full name was Minister Franklin Delano. So the rally there, and Stokely went at the invitation of, and that was brokered by Alinsky. So I had hopes that these two would come together. I will send you my annotated version of the minutes of a January 1967 SNCC meeting that discussed whether there would be some kind of cooperative arrangement with Alinsky. And it was clear, I mean, most of the people there had mistaken ideas of what Alinsky was all about. And Jim Foreman, who was very knowledgeable about this kind of stuff, he had what was generally a left bias against Alinsky. Especially the Communist Party left in this country did not like Alinsky. There were individual exceptions, but as a whole, they didn't like Alinsky. So to kind of jump ahead, later I met Herb March. So Herb March was an organizer in Back of the Yards, where Alinsky had done his first community organizing project. It's called Back of the Yards. And this is this neighborhood adjacent to the stockyards in Chicago, about which Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. So I'd hear from these people I was working with in SNCC, either in or related to the Communist Party. I'd hear this anti-Alinsky line. And so when I was in Chicago for something, or maybe I saw her at a national staff meeting. Ann Proston was at this staff meeting, and her husband, Jesse, was a key guy in the packing house workers union. So I said, Ann, I'm trying to get an understanding of why the CP-oriented left so hostile to Alinsky. And she said, well, you do better talking with this guy, Herb March. Herb is out in San Pedro, California, so you're close to him. Maybe you'll get down there. So I said, you got his contact information? And she did. She gave it to me. So I went to see him and his wife, Jane. We spent 4 hours together. And as you know, they warmed up to me, and the conversation's going well. And I said, Herb, I keep hearing this antagonism toward Alinsky from people around the CP. Can you tell me what's this all about? And he said, I had no strategic differences in back of the yards with Alinsky. My differences were political. And I thought, aha, now I'm going to get some kind of Marxian analysis of what's wrong with Alinsky as a bourgeois reformist or whatever. And so I said, I kind of sat forward in my chair. I said, what are those? So he said, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which he supported and Alinsky opposed. So I thought, oh my gosh. So I have never fully understood, but I mean, people write things that are just, they make them up out of whole cloth.
Well, you had said that you thought that Alinsky would have the answers or did have the answers to a lot of the things that SNCC was fighting over at the time. Can you, or dealing with at the time, can you kind of tell us what those main issues were?
Well, after the loss of the challenge, both the Democratic Party seating in 1964 at the Atlantic City Convention of the so-called regulars from Mississippi, the movement was trying to prevent their being seated as delegates at the convention. And most people thought that was going to succeed. Well, Lyndon Johnson put the kibosh on that, and it was defeated. And then at the opening of Congress, there was a challenge to the seating of the Mississippi congressional delegation. Technically, you could be elected by a state, and the House of Representatives could refuse to seat you. I think the same in the Senate. So I think around the time of World War I, there was a pacifist senator from maybe Wyoming or Idaho who the Senate refused to seat. So we had this campaign to not seat the Mississippi delegation, House delegate, and it got 150 something congressional votes, but it was far from sufficient not to seat them. So those two defeats kind of disillusioned a lot of SNCC people. And so their rhetoric got more militant, and there developed more nationalist views in SNCC. And SNCC was losing touch with its base. I mean, because it didn't have a concrete understanding of what it meant to build people power. It had the ideas in general, and it had some, Ella Baker was a great coach. Even she had this formulation that strong people don't need strong leaders, something like that. My amendment to that is weaker people, which is most people, need strong organizations. And when you build around strong people, but don't involve the constituency in an ongoing way, you end up with organizations that are very susceptible to leadership becoming disconnected from its constituency. And that happened as the SNCC leadership, as SNCC especially became more militant in its rhetoric, and it became isolated from the people it sought to organize. And I thought Alinsky had a lot of, both theoretical understanding of that and practical ways to mitigate against it and how you build organization that I think SNCC might have benefited from. But if you read these minutes, which I'll send you, and you'll see my annotations, it wasn't something that was going to happen. It clearly was not going to happen. By that time, I was already working for him in Kansas City, Missouri. So in October I started talking about October of 60, Alinsky was out here, and we were having these airport meetings. Bill Grace and Dave Knotts were the two key Presbyterians. Jim Guinan was their Episcopalian counterpart, and I would meet with Alinsky at the airport. And he'd be flying out here on his way to Carmel, to see his wife, who lived down there full time because Chicago winters were too much for her. She had multiple sclerosis, so she lived full time in their Carmel home. Alinsky would fly out, he'd land in San Francisco, and then he'd take the commuter flight down to Monterey. And usually he'd plan it so there were like 3 or 4 hours between his arrival and his departure. And so we'd have these long airport meetings. So we have this October airport meeting, and Alinsky gets up in the middle of it at some point. He says, Mike, he says, my guy in Kansas City is falling apart. I need somebody there. I need you there. And if you want to roll in the Institute, you got to do this. And I want you there in 3 weeks. You think about it. He said, I got to take a piss. That's a typical Alinsky thing. So he gets up and leaves. So I say to these the 3 clergy guys, I said, I can't leave here in 3 weeks. I'm married. I'm doing SNCC stuff. I can't just do it. Negotiate for time, Mike. Negotiate for time. So when Alinsky came back, I said, I want to do it, but I can't do it in 3 weeks, Saul. I need more time. So he said, all right, mid-December, I want you in Rochester, New York, where the guy who's the project director there, Ed Chambers, also supervises Kansas City. So you're going to go there and you're going to be brief on Kansas City. And then you're going to meet me in New York, and we're going to fly to Kansas City, Missouri together. Well, going to New York from Rochester to New York City, the sort of on the route was Peg Leg Bates. He had a summer retreat center up in the Catskills. He was a black dancer. One leg was a peg leg, and he was a terrific tap dancer. And he liked the movement. And so he gave the use of his camp to SNCC for a retreat. So I arrived on the day that the debate was taking place on the vote to exclude whites, and that vote passed. And I still remember Fannie Lou Hamer coming up to me in tears and saying, Mac, that's how she said my name, Mac, I just don't understand what they doing.
And so that was it for you. That, I mean, you were out.
I would have been out anyway.
Yeah.
So the timing was pretty good.
Did you get to say goodbye to everyone at SNCC that you wanted to say goodbye to?
I told them I came so I could say goodbye to y'all because I'm going to work for Alinsky in Kansas City. And I stayed in touch. Stokely and I were quite close.
Yeah. When did you first meet him?
On a speaking tour out here. He came out here probably in 63 or early 64. He came out on a speaking tour. We corresponded throughout, and I went to, there was a huge dinner honoring him in, God, when was that? Maybe the 80s or 90s. By then everyone knew that he had prostate cancer and was going to die. And so the woman who had been my wife when I was on SNCC staff, we were no longer married, but she and I went to this dinner to say goodbye to Stokely. He was very fond of her as well. And I don't cry real easily, but I remember walking with John Lewis and seeing me and waving and then say, John, there's Mike. And I just burst into tears. And Carol had put her arms around me. So I was really, back in those years, closer to him than to Bob.
There's that great picture I found of the two of you together online.
Yeah.
And so you would correspond a lot. And do you think you were?
But we'd correspond, and I'll send you. Did I send you the thing I wrote when he died?
I don't think so.
I'm going to send you a lot of stuff. You can toss what you don't want.
No, I'm not going to toss it. That's great. Yeah, please do. I'll make sure whichever archive gets this can have all that as well. So what do you think? I know a lot of people do blame him a lot with the end of SNCC in a lot of ways. How do you think that story's been mistold or misrepresented?
He's a symptom. He's a symptom, not the cause. I mean, the election where John Lewis was defeated as chair, I mean, that was a pretty slippery election. John had been reelected in the afternoon, and then on some technical grounds later that night, they had a recount or whatever, and Stokely won that election. I mean, it was a kind of I don't think a very kosher thing, but in any case, I mean, that's where the organization was moving away from John's principled nonviolence toward self-defense, and Black Power is a slogan, which John was not particularly fond of. So Stokely got elected. But Stokely, in these minutes, you'll see he's still he's ambiguous in the way he talks about Alinsky. He says at least he's still organizing on the ground, which we're not doing anyway. The minutes are worth your reading.
Yeah, I look forward to them very much.
So, and then Stokely kind of went on, he went on his own to, what was it called? Republic of New Africa, I think was the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I heard him speak when he came out here and spoke on campus at Berkeley. And it was, to me, it was mostly nationalist rhetoric. And you wouldn't have known that he was a very skillful on the ground organizer.
Why do you think he felt the need to turn to that so much? Do you think he was pushed that way in some sense, or he adapted, or?
Well, I asked him, I said, Stokely, I said, this rhetoric in the media this is a little bit earlier. I said, we can't retain our Northern white support for SNCC with this rhetoric. So I said, what do you think you're doing? And he said, well, Mike, I'm using the mainstream media to talk to the Black community. So Black Power was a divisive slogan in the Black community. I mean, it aroused people, and it got, even in Mississippi along that Meredith March route, the crowds cheered when Stokely would say Black Power. But it was a divisive slogan. And when you're only 10% of the population to begin with, you better unite a very, very broad base in your constituency if you're going to act with power in American politics. And that slogan did not do it, especially because there wasn't a reality of Black Power underneath it. Had there been, it would have been a different story. And the rhetoric wouldn't have been the same, because Black people would have told Stokely, no, this is too far out for our people.
And I know, selfishly, I've told you I'm writing a book on Lillian Smith right now, but I know that that's the point where even the few white integrationists and anti-racists that were on board with the movement and even aligned with SNCC really did drop their support, unfortunately. But that was the big catalyst for that. Did you know Lillian Smith at all, or did you know her writings? I know they were used in the freedom schools. And what were you reading at this time?
I knew her writing, but I didn't know her. What was I reading? I was reading Watts reports. The wide area telephone service typed up daily reports of what was going on in the South. I was reading Watts report. I was reading mostly organizational documents. I was not reading a lot of books in those days.
And so what do you think would be the main, what would be the biggest kind of accomplishment that you would say that you had out of that time period, or the biggest thing that you learned from working with SNCC?
Well, I think that SNCC was as responsible as anybody for breaking open the Deep South, for the passage of the Voting Rights Act, for the subsequent enforcement of it by the Justice Department, and had the country as a whole not turned to the right, so that we ended up with this very conservative Supreme Court that has done in a lot of what the Voting Rights Act accomplished. That breaking of the wall a solid wall of segregation and discrimination SNCC was as much responsible for that as anybody. SNCC, SCLC, CORE had a lesser presence in the South, and the NAACP branches. Aaron Henry and the NAA in Mississippi were equally part of that united thrust, and that broke apart. Do you know Did I tell you about the book Politics of Change?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Rachel Reinhardt, do you have that book?
I don't have it, but I have I read the article that you wrote on it, I think. Did you not send me? Maybe I'm thinking of something different. Sorry, go ahead.
You should get this book.
Okay.
Say, I have your mailing address. I'll send you, I'm going to give you a present.
Oh, thank you.
So when I read Rachel Reinhardt's thesis, which is really the decline of the MFDP, she interviewed me, and then I read her thesis, and I said to her, Rachel, this has to get a broader audience than a PhD thesis. So she said, well, what do you have in mind? I said, well, will you let me do an edit or adaptation or whatever you want to call it? So she agreed to that, and I did. I mean, she did a solid piece of research, and it's about, so by 68, there was an integrated delegation at the Democratic Party, but it was half white, half black, and half of the black half was Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. But that's only a quarter of the delegation. So by 68, there was a whole new different face on the Democratic Party in Mississippi. And MFDP was either co-opted into it, or in a few counties where it had strength, it still had a presence, but it was not the voice of the Democratic Party in Mississippi anymore.
Do you see that year 1968 as being in many ways a symbolic end to the movement, or how do you kind of place that time-wise?
No, things are still perking along in different. Yeah, if you say symbolic, that might be right. It's a continuous decline. I mean, there were things that were growing, like Fannie Lou Hamer's pig farm. That's in the 70s, I think, and that was a vital thing for a while, and then it ran out of money. And there were local, in counties where there was a black majority. There were the school boards were becoming black, county boards of supervisors, local city councils. It's sort of like Reconstruction in a way. The breaking down of racial barriers, formal racial barriers, was taking place, but nothing was addressing the economic justice issues. MFDP had that as central to its purpose, but this new democratic formulation was not going to go much beyond the boundaries of the war on poverty. And the war on poverty had made the Congress and Johnson and Kennedy, Johnson, and the Democrats had made a decision in that early 60s to mid 60s period. They were not going to support full employment legislation. And without that, you could have affirmative action, so you could break some barriers, discriminatory barriers, and it created a new strata of working class, whatever you want to call them, people, black people in Mississippi. But without full employment legislation that was funded and implemented, you were not going to end poverty in the Deep South.
And when was the last time you went to Mississippi? Did you continue to travel there after 68 much, or?
Yeah, I went to either 2 or 3 reunions, and I wrote about them. You'll get that too. But the SNCC reunions, I was unhappy for the most part. They were more celebrations of what we did rather than critical review, and I wanted to see more critical discussion. What could we have done different with the benefit of hindsight and current knowledge? What could we have done differently, sustained the goals that we had more fully? People weren't too interested in that.
Do you think it was partially due to their age and just not having the energy and the time to invest anymore? Do you think things had become so good, in certain ways, that they didn't feel like it was that urgent, or what was the reasoning?
I think they just wanted to celebrate. Stokely wrote me. He said, I was there, you and I were there, and we got to see them all celebrating as if everything was achieved in the 60s. And he said, but there are few people like you and I who still think work needs to be done. I'm just a little crazier than you, or something like that.
So what do you think specifically in these Deep South states that haven't been flipped? What strategies do you think we should adopt to change things here?
Well, the critical question to me is, how do you break working class and poor whites out of the grip of racist ideology? And and views. And as the South again becomes more polarized on race, it becomes increasingly difficult to do that. And you certainly, so where do you start? Except in those circumstances where you have people, like they're together in the same building, as it were, at a workplace. So it's pretty easy to persuade people you can't have a whites only union because they'll fire all the whites and hire blacks.
Mhm.
And here's where they've done it before. And you tell the story of Masonite in Laurel, Mississippi, many other examples of that. But except for those kind of circumstances, I think the organizing is going to have to be on parallel track. And then you look for opportunities where poor white people or working class white people need that black people have. And so you can say, well, maybe we got to talk with them if we want to get this. So let's see what happens if we sit down and talk. And out of that, I mean, that's what essentially Jack Minnis and Bob Zellner did in Laurel, Mississippi. They went in, there was a strike at the Masonite plant. Masonite had sent a guy from their national office to work there internally as to dope out what was going on the factory floor. And he concluded, well, we'll put end segregated water fountains and bathrooms, and we'll win the blacks and polarize it from the whites. And that's what they did, and it worked. So when Minnis and Zellner arrived, there were black scabs, despite the fact that MFDP in Laurel was supporting the strike, because by this time MFDP was also marginalized. So Minnis and Zellner went and they met with the white leadership of the International Woodworkers of America local there. And they were open about their background in the civil rights movement. Said, you guys want some help we have relationships with these people who are scabbing. And they did. And so to make a long story short, they agreed, all right, there's going to be a committee of 6, 3 whites, 3 blacks. And when we meet, we're going to alternate our meetings between white homes and black homes. It turned out that one of the 3 white guys was a member of the Klan. So when they went to meet in his den, he had Klan paraphernalia was on the wall. A lot of these whites in that union local changed. I mean, they changed. There's a story I tell somewhere about this white woman who's the wife of one of these woodworker guys, who says to an interviewer, I never thought I'd shake hands with a Negro. And so later on, there was a break. There was a segment of those whites who came to understand, this segregationist racism we're pursuing is not in our interest. But again, you need skillful organizers doing this. Now, a friend of mine, Gerald Taylor, who's a very skillful organizer, he's doing some stuff now in Mississippi. And I just wrote him a long letter. He wrote me back, he said, Mike, he says, I didn't know I was going to wake up this morning to a whole bunch of homework.
And he's trying to organize interracial coalitions or among white people, or?
This is a guy, can you imagine this? He's a black guy, and in Brooklyn, he organized in the Hasidic Jewish community, and he was successful.
Wow. Yeah, that says something for sure.
So this is an extraordinary guy.
And so let's go back now to, I guess that was 68 that you were totally done and going to work with Alinsky. That was 66.
66. That's the
66.
End of 66. So Alinsky and I meet at the Newark airport sometime between Christmas and New Year's, and we fly together to Kansas City, Missouri. And he introduces me to the local leadership there. And and he said to me when I went there, he said, now this is gonna be your school, Mike. Well, I was in over my head. And by, I don't know, the 8th or 9th month or something like that, I was there. I was having really bad headaches. I mean, really bad headaches. So I went to the doctor and they did a full physical workup and they couldn't find anything wrong. He said, what do you do? What do you do in your job? So I started telling him. He says, you got to quit that job. I said, I can't quit the job. He says, well, I prescribed Darabont for you, which is a strong anti something or other, but I'm not going to prescribe it if I think you're going to be on it indefinitely. So I said, well, the contract ends in July of 68 and I'll be done. And he said, okay, so I took a Darvon every day until I left. I flew out of there, landed in San Francisco. The next day, no headache. It was that clearly correlated to, the organization, I mean, it's a digression, I think, to go into more detail unless you want to, but I was in over my head and I could not, it was already a year old and I was not the person to rescue it if anybody could have rescued it, which in retrospect, I kind of doubt.
What was the goal, the overall goal of that particular?
Well, in all his project, Alinsky would say, the goal is to build power, is to build people power that has the capacity to address whatever are the concerns of the people who are the members and constituency of that organization in a framework of small d democratic values. So there's no initial issue, not even a focus on issues in the sense that most people do. The focus is in the beginning, the focus is on what issues, on the one hand, meaningful enough to local people, but on the other hand, small enough so that they are winnable with a relatively group of people. And then as you win those smaller issues and the word gets out and neighbors talk to neighbors, coworkers talk to coworkers, and then people begin to get the idea, hey, maybe these people know what they're doing. So skeptics become participants. I mean, that's the cycle of building mass power, turning skeptics. I mean, most people are very skeptical of organizations. They've had many losing experiences. And there's a general sense of defeatism, which is why they're vulnerable scapegoats and the savior leader Trump embodies. The use of scapegoats and the savior leader. But when people have experience of winning through their own activity, it's a deeply gratifying experience. And so they become more active and they get their friends involved. That's the cycle. Small issue, win, get more people involved. Bigger issue, win, get more people involved. Even bigger issue, get more people involved. And you have to be multi-issue because different people experience different problems at different times in their lives. So the retiree isn't going to care much about a local childcare center, but the single mothers sure are going to. And the retiree is going to be concerned about safety on the block, but they can come together to support each other in the framework of a multi-issue organization. So these organizations are all multi-issue.
And when you moved back to the Bay Area, then did you have a job in place or did you just head back and?
So when I was in Kansas City, I was still in touch with people in the Mission District. So I was giving my 2 cents worth on the anti-urban renewal fight in San Francisco. So by the time I was headed back, they knew that they wanted to build a multi-issue community organization. And they said to me, we want you to come to work for us when you come back. I said, I don't know if I'm ready to do that. This might not be my line of work, or however I said it. So they begged me. I said, all right, well, so we reached a compromise. I would help them organize a founding convention. The procedure of these organizations was there would first be a sponsor committee. Sponsor committee was typically denominational leaders and key local pastors who would legitimize the effort by who they were, who would provide the initial funding. So under the umbrella of this sponsor committee, you would then local organizations, churches, block clubs, youth groups, small business associations, anything that walked and talked you would enlist, come, and there'd be some small issue campaigns maybe to demonstrate the efficacy of this approach, and that the organizer knew what she or he was doing. But there would be a founding convention, and these groups would all send delegates. So we had a founding convention. I was going to help them organize a founding convention. We had a founding convention, I think either 600 or 800 delegates and alternates from about 60 organizations. So that was very good. And even though it was disrupted by a militant youth group, it resumed a month later and still had enough momentum that, so I decided, well, maybe I can do this after all. So after the convention, I said, all right, I'll come to work with you full time. And I never looked back.
And you stayed with them until retirement.
Well, so that I stayed there until, let's see, that's 68. I stayed there until 72. And that was I wrote a book about that experience called A Community Organizer's Tale. I think you'd enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll write that down too.
So then my life has been a succession of wonderful accidents in the sense of my work. So I was going to leave MCO, Mission Coalition Organization, in the early 70s, 71, 72. And I thought, God, what am I going to do next? And kind of out of the blue, these people in Visitation Valley, which is another neighborhood in San Francisco, called me up and asked me if I'd come and talk with them. Well, they want to have an organization in Visitation Valley. So how did that happen? I mean, it's a small world story. There was a guy by the name of Noel Day. Noel Day is a Black guy from Boston who I'd met through SNCC activity years earlier. And then later at an unemployment conference that you know the name Stanley Aronowitz?
I know the name.
Yeah. So Stanley's a left Marxist sociologist, lively, bright guy. Stanley was a spark plug of a thing called the Conference for Full Employment or something like that. So I went to that whenever it was in the late 60s, something like that. And I met Noel Day, who's in Massachusetts at the time. Then Noel comes out to the Bay Area and he starts a thing called Urban Rural Systems Analyst. It's a contracting technical assistance. So somehow or other, people in Visitation Valley connected with Noel Day through a San Francisco Foundation grant to get the benefit of his expertise in addressing the problems of Sunnydale Housing Project, which is where I had grown up.
Mm-hmm.
So
I recognize that name.
So they called me up and say, we've got this grant to do work in Sunnydale Housing Project. We'd like to talk with you. Well, we heard about you from Noel Day. So that's how the Noel Day connection happens. So they interviewed me and I said, yeah, I'd like to come to work here, but Sunnydale Housing Project is too small a constituency to exercise power. So you have to broaden this to the whole of Visitation Valley, which included more working class people and was mixed racially, Latino, Black, Asian, and white. So they were initially skeptical. So I said, well, you guys sponsor a workshop. I'll do a 2-day workshop. You invite everybody who might be, and then you guys draw a conclusion at the end. So they liked what they heard and they decided to do it. And then some people who had not come started raising objections. So I said, well, do a second workshop. They come to the second workshop. So I did a second workshop and most of them liked it also. So I got hired to do that. And then I got hired by there was some citywide coalition called Coalition for Effective Schools. We had our first elected school board in San Francisco at the same time that we had court-ordered busing. And so all the integrationists and liberals in town feared a right-wing takeover of the school board. So they hired me to coordinate thing called the election campaign of the Coalition for Effective Schools, which endorsed a Latino guy, a Black woman, a Chinese guy, a white labor guy from the AFL-CIO, and a white liberal Jewish education activist. We elected four of them. Nobody expected that. So I'm now developing a reputation as an organizer. And one thing led to another. I'd have these moments when I think, shit, how am I going to pay the rent?
That's what I was going to ask. Were you ever really worried about money?
What am I going to do to pay the rent? And something would drop out of the sky. And then I started Organized Training Center, and we started getting contracts to do workshops here and there around the country. And then organizations would develop out of those. And then those organizations would contract with us for continuing workshop and consulting services. So my life stabilized. And that lasted through the late 70s and 80s. And then we started a thing in mid 70s called the Citizens Action League, which became a statewide organization. But it was very flimsy, shall we say. And so sometime in the late 70s, Arnie Graff, who moved out here. Oh, no. Arnie Graff did a workshop. That's right. The National Conference on Catholic Charities had what they called a parish outreach program. National Conference of Catholic Charities had this program called Parish Outreach, used a methodology that had been developed by Alinsky's Industrial Areas Foundation to build local community organizations. And it focused on congregations, and it used an organizing process that both built a powerful community organization, but also contributed to the renewal of the internal life of the member congregation or parish. And that's a whole discussion in itself. But so we had this thing called the Citizens Action League that we started in 74. And by 78, I had concluded that it's like holding water in your hand, just a little crack and it disappears. So Arnie Graff was the East Coast consultant to this Catholic Charities thing. And so I went to a workshop and it was pretty persuasive. So then he did another workshop, and I took I invited two of the people who were working for me at Citizens Action League, Josie Mooney and Larry Gordon. So the three of us went to Arnie Graff's 2-day workshop. And at the end of it, we were persuaded, he has basically the answers to all the questions we've been having about this water in the palm of our hands. So we said, well, let's do this in San Francisco. By that time, I had a lot of relationships in San Francisco. So we put together what became a religion labor coalition. Nobody's ever done. About a dozen union locals, 20 some religious congregations. Nobody's done it anyplace else in the country. So Josie and Larry were like the on the ground organizers. I raised the front end money, and I consulted with them and did workshops for the emerging leadership. And so the word started spreading in religious networks about our doing this. So by the early 80s, maybe it's the mid 80s, we had continuing, long-term 2, 3, 4-year contractual relationships with groups in Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, San Mateo County, Santa Barbara County, Tucson, Arizona, Denver, Colorado, rural Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska. Maybe I've forgotten one. So that was pretty stable for about a 10-year period. And then, so Industrial Areas Foundation was also doing this, and a thing called the Pacific Institute for Community Organizing was also doing it, but they were networks. And my Organized Training Center was just a consulting. So I tried to persuade the groups with which I was doing the consulting that we should also become a network, but I couldn't persuade them. But then they individually became persuaded. And so they went either with PICO or IF. So out of I think at the maximum, we had 11 contracts. I think 4 groups are still going and are part of PICO. 4 are still going and are part of IAF, and 3 didn't last. So that's not bad.
Yeah, it's a pretty good record.
Yeah, but I was losing that. Now we're starting to lose work. So oh my God, what am I going to do now? What's next? Well, then a friend of mine who was in the East returned to the West, and he was a labor organizer guy. He and I had coffee, and he said, Mike, he said, I got to find some work. He was working on his PhD at UMass Boston in the economics department. So he was writing the dissertation, but he needed income. So I said, his name is Michael Eisenshire. So I said, wait, Michael, don't do anything. I've got an idea. So I had this idea about applying this methodology of internal renewal, organizational renewal, that had been elaborated in religious congregations to union locals. And so we started a thing called the Project for Labor Renewal. So I raised the money and I hired the staff, which was Michael and a black guy by the name of Jamal. What did he develop an African name? Anyway, so the two of them did on the ground work. I consulted with them and raised the front end money. Around that time, so the ship is beginning to stabilize a little bit again. And around that time, a Presbyterian clergyman by the name of Robert Linthicum, he's an I think I might have mentioned him.
Mm-hmm.
He's an evangelical Presbyterian, and he's deeply committed to community organizing. He's the co-director of the Office of Urban Advance of World Vision International, which is a big international relief operation based in evangelical and Pentecostal traditions in the United States. So I read something Bob wrote that I liked, and I wrote him, and he wrote back, and one thing led to another, and he asked me to do a workshop for him down in Southern California. So at this workshop was a woman named Marilyn Stransky. I think I told you the story.
You told me about her for sure. Yeah.
So she fought me for the first day. I couldn't get a paragraph out. And then she would tell you, I want to connect you to. She would tell you that she had a conversion experience. So I got her a placement in the Denver group, which is where she and her husband lived, with the Denver group that I'd been consulting with. It was now an affiliate of PICO. And after 6 months, she said to me, I want to bring the message of this work to my parts of the church. And I want you to be the consultant. So I said, how are you going to explain me, a fallen away Jew, into this world of fundamentalist Christian beliefs? So Bob Linthicum, is a meeting. There was Marilyn, Bob Linthicum, and his co-director at World Vision, an Australian guy, Australian Baptist by the name of Ken Luscombe. So they said, you let us worry about that. So I did. And I did that for almost 10 years. I worked with them, out of which came a thing called Christians Supporting Community Organizing, which was leaders in evangelical Pentecostal holiness traditions who wanted to bring their strands of Christendom into this PICO, IAF, so on related community organizing that was going on around the country. So it made few dents, but it did affect some seminaries. So there's a woman who came to the workshop and who taught, where did she teach? In Memphis seminary she was at. We made dents in a couple of seminaries, and a couple of people, or a few people, were recruited to become organizers. And here and there, local churches joined their local broad-based community organizing project. But that went on for 8 or 10 years. So that kept me going a while. And I'd pick up consultancies here and there. And I was teaching also. I was an adjunct at Berkeley, at San Francisco State, at Hayward State, at Lone Mountain College, which was a Catholic women's school. And then I taught in a Notre Dame summer session that the Catholic Committee on Urban Ministry put on. And then later, Aaron Schutz had me teach at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, teaching.
What an amazing life. I mean, I can't believe all the different things you've done. It's just absolutely amazing. Coming down to the last few minutes here, though, I wanted to get your, I guess, kind of philosophical answer of, if you were giving, a presentation today or giving one of your workshops, what would be the main point or points of wisdom that you would try to impart to organizers or activists or anybody trying to change things today?
Go back to the base. Go back to everyday people. The problems everyday people face in their everyday lives are not immigrants. They're not the other. They're material and spiritual problems that can be positively affected through democratic participation. And the vehicle for democratic participation in the workplace is a labor union. and in the community is one of these kinds of community organizations. And this is how they do, this is what they do, and this is how they do it. That's my message. Very
And
simple.
such an important one. I mean, I can't believe we haven't had more organizations that, like you said, that combine labor and religion and these different topics.
Okay, Carrie Lee.
All right. Thanks so much. Have a good night or good afternoon for you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.